So this week we're starting something new. We're going to start genetics, which is something we're going to talk about for probably the next month. Genetics is all about how you inherit traits. So we already know about DNA, we've talked about that, and you get your DNA, but when you get your DNA, you only get half from your mom and half from your dad. So then how do you decide whether you use your dad's traits or your mom's traits or a combination of both of them? And so the rules for that, those are called genetics. And that takes us to this guy here. His name is Gregor Mendel, and he was an Austrian monk who, around about the same time as Charles Darwin, was breeding his pea plants in his monastery and discovering the rules of inheritance. So he was, like I said, Austrian, and he studied the inheritance of traits in pea plants, and he developed the laws of inheritance, and like a lot of scientists, his work was not recognized until well after his death. So he had, his journals and whatever, and they kind of just packed them away and left them alone until eventually people rediscovered them. And again, he was a monk, like a priest living in a monastery, so he wasn't working for a university, trying to publish research papers. He wasn't looking for fame and those sort of things. So that probably also played into the fact that people didn't know who he was at the time. So between 1856 and 1863, Mendel grew thousands of pea plants, and he found that plants' offspring often retained the traits of parents. So proving inheritance, which no one had done before. Mendel stated that physical traits are inherited as particles, so he called it particulate inheritance. Something is being passed from parent to offspring, whatever that particle is. Nowadays, we know what that particle is. We know that that particle is chromosomes and DNA, and those get passed from parent to child, but at the time, no one had discovered DNA. It wouldn't be another 100 years until they did. So heredity is the passing on of characteristics or traits from parents to offspring. So we are studying heredity. We're studying how traits are passed on from parent to offspring. And genetics is the study of heredity. So genetics is the study of inheritance of traits. So why did he choose peas? Well, you can grow them in a small area, and monasteries don't tend to be very long. They also make lots of offspring. That gives you a chance for lots of data. They can produce something called pure plants, which is not something you can do with a lot of other species. So you can take a plant and you can make it have babies with itself, like these little clones. And if you pollinate with itself for many generations, you get these pure plants or clone plants, and they only have their own traits. They're not crossbreed with anything else. And they can also be artificially cross-pollinated. You can, take a little cotton swab and rub it on one plant's flower and then rub it on the other plant's flower and kind of pretend like you're the bee. And so that's something that it makes it very easy to control who is reproducing with whom. And so that's the benefit of peas. Peas have a lot of traits as well that you can look at, and these are mostly Mendelian traits, meaning there's just two different kinds. So you could have purple or white flowers, you could have side flowers or top flowers, you could have yellow peas or green peas, you could have round peas or wrinkled peas. Your pods could be inflated or they could be constricted. You could have green pod color or yellow pod color, and then plants can be tall or they can be short or dwarf plants. And so they have these traits where you just kind of have two traits, and there's lots of those two trait characteristics in peas, which make them kind of an ideal plant for studying genetics. Fertilization is where you take male and female gametes and you put them together. So Mendel did what's called a cross, where you combine gametes from parents with different traits. So if you take two parents and fertilize sperm and egg, then you get a cross. Mendel crossed flowers that were true breeding, so the parents had only one trait, and they only produced offspring with that same trait. And we would call those parents, these true breeding, this word true breeding or pure, these are called homozygotes, and we'll talk about that a little later as well. Homozygotes have just one trait, they have one gene. So if you look here, one of the ways that we abbreviate traits is with letters. So here, purple is capital P, and it has two capital P's. That's like pure or true breeding. It's got two of the same trait. That's also called homozygous. So this purple plant has just purple genes inside of it. And then cross it with a white plant, which you can see is lowercase, lowercase. Lowercase represents the recessive trait. Again, we'll cover that in a second. And so this white plant only has the recessive trait of white. So only purple crossed with only white. What do you think is going to happen? And the answer was all purple. Okay? The first generation of purple crossed with white had only purple. There were never any white. So then the question is, where did the white color go? So why is there no white here? Why is it just purple? What happened? So then the next step was to take two of his first generation. So he took the two of these, let me go back a slide. He took like this one and crossed them together. And so they, if you look at their letters, they're not just purple. They're capital P, which stands for purple, but they're also lowercase p, which stands for white. And so that white trait is still there in the genes, it's just not getting expressed. And same thing over here, capital P for purple, lowercase p for white. So that white trait is there, it's just hidden. The purple trait, the capital one, is covering it up. And so he crossed those purple plants, but that also had the white genes inside of them. And what he found is that mostly purple, but the white trait did come back about 25% of the time. So for every 3 purple flowers, you got 1 white flower. So if you look here at the letters, it makes a little bit more sense. So this one inherited 2 capital P's, so it just got purple. This one inherited a capital P and a lowercase p, but remember the capital, the dominant, it squishes the recessive. You can't express both traits. So you go with the dominant one if you have both. Same thing here, dominant recessive, so we're just going to express the capital one, the dominant one, purple. And here we only got 2 lowercases. So if we only got 2 lowercases, then the trait is white. So you have to get 2 recessives in order to have the least common trait, the recessive trait. So Mendel noticed in the first generation all of the white flowers disappeared, and he called this the recessive trait. So when you do a cross, if one of the traits disappears, then that is your recessive trait. And the white color isn't gone. The genes for white are still there. They're just being suppressed. They're being covered up by the genes for purple. And so it will come up again whenever you get a flower that has both recessive lowercase letters. So the color purple that seemed to mask over the recessive color was named the dominant trait. So the one that covers over the other one is the dominant. And Mendel was responsible for figuring out that each plant actually had 2 sets of instructions, one from mom and one from dad. And that's a really important discovery. Not that you have DNA, but that half of it comes from your mom and half of it comes from your dad. And then these rules of genetics determine what's going to be expressed. That's some pretty complicated stuff to not ever seen DNA or to see, mitosis and to see how you inherit genes. So like many scientists, how his work wasn't accepted until after he died. That's a pretty common thing in science. So about 100 years later, people were like, hey, this is some pretty cool data. And it got published. So let's look at some examples. If you cross a true breeding black rabbit, so true breeding is another word for homozygous, which is what you're going to see most often in this class. Homozygous, or pure, sometimes you'll see. So homozygous black rabbit with a true breeding white rabbit. So just like we did with the peas, this one is all black and this one is all white. And all of the offspring are black. So which trait is dominant, black or white? So if we look at the Punnett square, this is something you'll do to predict the outcomes, and something that we'll do a bit more at the end of this video. So you have a black rabbit, capital B, and you had a white rabbit. So they said true breeding black, this is what that would look like, and then true breeding white, or homozygous white, so lowercase b. So you cross them together, and so this parent passes on 1 capital B, and this parent gives 1 lowercase b. And so you get a capital from one parent and a lowercase from the other, and a capital from one parent and a lowercase from the other. And so even though all of the children here, all of the baby rabbits, have that white gene, none of them are expressing them because they're all expressing that dominant trait, that capital B. So the dominant trait covers up the recessive trait unless you have 2 copies of the recessive trait. So if you filled in this Punnett square, you're going to bring down the letter from the top and then the letter from the side, and then letter from the top, letter from the side. You always list capitals before lowercases though. So if we brought this one down and this one over, this B, capital B, would go first before the lowercase b. So what are the odds of having a blue-eyed child? So let's fill this in. Letter from the top, letter from the side, letter from the side first because it's capital, and then the top, down and then over, and then down and then over. So this is your possibilities from two brown-eyed parents that are both heterozygote for that brown color, meaning they're carrying the blue-eyed allele, but they're not expressing it. So what are their odds? Well, their odds are 75%. This one has brown eyes, this one has brown eyes, this one has brown eyes, 75% brown, and then just 25% blue. So 25%, or 1 out of 4, they have odds of getting a child that has blue eyes, and that's what Punnett squares allow you to do. They allow you to get the ratios or the odds that something may or may not happen. So if we filled in this Punnett square here, bring your letters down, and they're asking for what are the odds of having a yellow P offspring. So what are the odds that we're going to have yellow? Yellow is the dominant trait, capital Y. So fill that out. So letter from the side, letter from the top, etc. Always list capitals before lowercases. You can see that 2 get the capital, and so they will be yellow, and these 2 at the bottom didn't get any capitals, so they will be green. So 50% yellow, 50% green from that cross. So rules of unit factors, alleles. Alleles is a very important term. So out there in a population, there are different forms of the same gene. An example would be, let me go back here, there's an allele for green in peas, there's an allele for yellow. And if we go back even more, there's an allele for brown eyes, there's an allele for blue. They're different copies of the same gene. They do the same thing, they're in the same place in the DNA, but they give different outcomes. That's what an allele is. It's a different copy of the same gene. So in humans, there's alleles for all the different hair colors that humans can have, and there's alleles for all the different skin colors that humans can have. And so these are things that humans have, but we all have different versions of them. And then genes are located on chromosomes, and they control just like a single trait of how an organism develops. The 2 alleles for a trait must separate. That's very important. So when your parents go to give you your first cell, either a sperm cell or an egg cell, they can't give you both copies of their DNA. They can only give you one. So they have to separate those cells from each other when the gametes are formed. And then the parent randomly, that is an important word because that leads to lots of genetic variation, randomly gives you one. They just pick one randomly and they give it to you. And so you randomly get an assortment of traits from each parent. This is also why even if you have siblings and you have the same parent, you don't look exactly the same, because each parent randomly handed you a set of genes. And you could get the dominant trait or you could get the recessive trait from either parent. If they have it, it's random. So this is just that random assortment. You could have these odds, and then you could lead to these kids, but you take your traits like A and you separate them into different cells, and what you pass on is random. So phenotype is a way an organism looks on the outside. So when we're talking about genes, we can't see genes, but we can see phenotypes. Phenotypes are like yellow peas, wrinkled peas, green peas. Those are phenotypes. Now you can't like cut the pea open and look at its genes and say, okay, is there a capital letter G in there? That's like not how it works. But what you can do is you can look at the way the organism looks and you can say, okay, based on how they look, their phenotype, I know what trait they have. So red hair or brown hair are phenotypes. Genotype is your gene combinations, and that's internal. So are you, 2 capital letters, dominant? Are you 1 capital, 1 lowercase, which is called heterozygous? Or are you 2 lowercase letters, which is homozygous, recessive? So, what are your genes? This is a lot harder to see without doing a whole lot of test crosses or like sequencing your DNA. So this is not a part of you that I can just see by looking at you. So heterozygous, this is a word you're going to hear a lot, is if the 2 alleles are different. The root hetero means different. Like you may have heard that before in like heterosexual. A heterosexual is someone interested in a different sex than themselves. So hetero is different. And so these letters, you can see they're different. Capital, lowercase. That's not the same. Different. And then homo means same. And so homozygous is if the letters are the same. So capital, capital, or lowercase, lowercase. So that's heterozygous. There's 2 different ways to be homozygous. You can be homozygous dominant or the homozygous recessive. Dihybrid cross is something we'll do next week. So this is where you have two different traits. You'll have a bunch of different letters. We're not going to talk about that right now. Monohybrid is what we're doing this week, where we're talking about just one trait. So just the A's, whereas here you have A's and E's, and we'll do that later. But we'll stick with one trait just for this week. So all the vocabulary that you need to write down in your notes, these are things that we all went through during the video, so I won't read them to you again, but you can pause this video and you can write down the definitions, for as long as you need, and then click play and go on to the next definitions.
These days, scientists know how you inherit characteristics from your parents. They're able to calculate probabilities of having a specific trait or getting a genetic disease according to the information they have from the parents and the family history. But how is this possible? To understand how traits pass from one living being to its descendants, we need to go back in time to the 19th century and a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk and biologist who loved to work with plants. By breeding the pea plants he was growing in the monastery's garden, he discovered the principles that rule heredity. In one of the most classic examples, Mendel combined a purebred yellow-seeded plant with a purebred green-seeded plant, and he got only yellow seeds. He called the yellow color trait the dominant one, because it was expressed in all the new seeds. Then he let the new yellow-seeded hybrid plants self-fertilize, and in this second generation he got both yellow and green seeds, which meant that the green trait had been hidden by the dominant yellow. He called this hidden trait the recessive trait. From those results, Mendel inferred that each trait depends on a pair of factors, one of them coming from the mother and the other from the father. Now we know that these factors are called alleles and represent the different variations of a gene. Depending on which type of allele Mendel found in each seed, we can have what we call a homozygous pea, where both alleles are identical, and what we call a heterozygous pea, when the two alleles are different. This combination of alleles is known as genotype, and its result, being yellow or green, is called phenotype. To clearly visualize how alleles are distributed amongst descendants, we can use a diagram called the Punnett square. You just place the different alleles on both axes, and then you figure out the possible combinations. Let's look at Mendel's peas, for example. Let's write the dominant yellow allele as an uppercase y, and the recessive green allele as a lowercase y. The uppercase y always overpowers its lowercase friend, so the only time you get green babies is if you have two lowercase y's. In Mendel's first generation, the yellow homozygous pea mom will give each pea kid a yellow dominant allele, and the green homozygous pea dad will give a green recessive allele, so all the pea kids will be yellow heterozygous. Then, in the second generation, where the two heterozygous kids marry, their babies could have any of the three possible genotypes, showing the two possible phenotypes in a 3-to-1 proportion. But even peas have a lot of characteristics. For example, besides being yellow or green, peas may be round or wrinkled. So we could have all these possible combinations: round yellow peas, round green peas, wrinkled yellow peas, and wrinkled green peas. To calculate the proportions for each genotype and phenotype, we can use a Punnett square too. Of course, this will make it a little more complex. And lots of things are more complicated than peas, like, say, people. These days, scientists know a lot more about genetics and heredity, and there are many other ways in which some characteristics are inherited, but it all started with Mendel and his peas.
Okay, so for the last part here, you have some problems that you need to fill out, and these are Punnett squares, and they are a tool that scientists use to predict the outcome of a cross. So here it says in rabbits, black fur is dominant over white fur. So it's telling you which trait is dominant, which trait is the capital letter. So black is going to be the dominant one, and white is going to be the recessive one. Show a cross of a heterozygous black male. Hetero, remember, means different, so he is capital B, lowercase b, because his alleles need to be different. He is capital lowercase. And a homozygous, homo means same, white female, and white is the recessive trait, so she is lowercase lowercase. And it doesn't matter who you put on top and who you put on the side, you'll get the same answer regardless, so don't stress about that. So whether mom goes on top or the side or dad, whatever, who cares? So then you bring one letter over from the side and then one letter down from the top, and then capitals always get listed before lowercases. So same thing, letter over from the side, letter down from the top, and so you have the capital B, lowercase b, and then this will go down to this box, and this will go over. So that's actually a mistake there. This should be lowercase b, lowercase b. And then the letter over from the side here and down from the top. And that one is correct. It should be lowercase b, which it is. So fix that one, make it lowercase b, lowercase b. So it looks like the genotypes are correct, even though I did make that little mistake there. So it's asking for phenotype and genotype. So genotypes are the letters, phenotype is what it looks like on the outside. So the genotype here, how many capital B's did we get? And you can see that there are none, so that's why that's a 0. And then how many capital B's, lowercase b's did we get? Well, we got 1, 2 out of 4. There are 4 total. So 2 out of 4 is that 50%. So list those in percents. That's the most common thing. 2 out of 4. And then for lowercase b's, we got 1, 2 out of 4 again, so that's why that's 50%. And then black fur and white fur, so you have 50% black fur and 50% white fur. These two on the top are black fur, and these two on the bottom are white fur. And so that's why it's 50-50. Alright, so when you do them yourself, you can pick whatever letters you want. I recommend you use letters that look different in their capital and lowercase form. So here's an example. A capital looks like that, and A lowercase looks like that, and they don't look anything like each other. Same thing with B. B is a good choice. Capital B doesn't look a whole lot like lowercase b. They definitely look different from each other. But C capital and C lowercase, they look the same. So I would avoid using letters like that. Same thing with like S. So like S capital, S lowercase, because it's hard to tell, like, is that capital, is that lowercase, or did I just write it smaller that time? So to not confuse yourself, stick to the letters, and you can use whatever you want. Stick to the letters that look different in their capital and lowercase form. So here we have tall and short. Okay. Tall is the dominant trait, short is the recessive trait. So I'm going to use the letter T, because T in its capital form and T in its lowercase form, they do look different. So I'm going to use the letter T. It says a homozygous short plant. This would be homozygous short. Short is the recessive trait. That's how I know these are capital lowercase t's. It is crossed with a homozygous tall. Homozygous tall, they have to be the same, and it has to be tall. Tall is the dominant trait. So one is totally short, only short genes. One is totally tall, only tall genes. So then we fill this out. Capital T, lowercase t, capital T, lowercase t, capital T, lowercase t, capital T, lowercase t. All of the offspring are going to inherit a capital T from one parent and a lowercase t from the other. So now for phenotype and genotype. So for phenotype, how many capital T's do we get? And the answer there is 0. So you just list these as like a list of 3. 0, capital T, capital T. And if you can't remember what you're supposed to do, you can refer back up to this one here for an example. And then the next one would be the heterozygote. So how many capital T, lowercase t's do we get? And the answer is 100. 100% capital T, lowercase t. And then the other possibility was 0, and we didn't get any of the lowercase t's. So these are the 3 possible genotype outcomes, and you list all 3, and then you write like how many you got of each. Again, you can refer back to this first one here. So then for traits, the traits were short or tall. So we want to do the same thing. How many shorts did we get? And then what's the ratio to talls? Alright, so none of these are short, because to be short you have to be the homozygous recessive, lowercase t, and none of these are that way. So this is going to be 0% short, and they are going to be 100% tall, because they all inherited at least one of the dominant trait. So that's how you do that. All right, let's do another one. So in humans, free earlobes are dominant to attached. Two parents are both heterozygous, free, are expecting a child. What are the chances the child will have free earlobes? Well, let's say or. That's supposed to say or attached, not of attached. Free earlobes or attached. All right, so earlobes, let's use E, because E looks different in its capital and lowercase form, but again, you can use whatever letter you want. That doesn't matter. So free earlobes are dominant. Free would be the capital E, attached would be the lowercase e. There's a lot of typos here. Two parents, not parented, two parents that are both heterozygous free. So they are both heterozygotes. Heterozygotes are always capital lowercase. They're both capital lowercase. All right, fill this out. Bring the capital E down and the capital E over, and then bring the capital E over and the lowercase e down, and then bring the capital E down and the lowercase e over, and then bring down the lowercase e from the top and the lowercase e from the side. All right, so then what are their ratios? And I might just type this because it's actually a little bit easier to type it than it is to write it out. So first we start with the homozygous dominant, which would be the capital E, and so they have 25% capital E, because you got one kid here with capital E. Then the next one is the heterozygote, and so this would be 50% capital E, lowercase e, heterozygote. And then the last one is the homozygous recessive, which would be 25%, that one. All right, so then for traits, so you have attached and free. So this one is free, free, free. So they have 3 out of 4 is free. That's 75% free earlobes. And then that leaves 25% attached. So what are their odds of getting an attached child? 25% is their odds there. And then let's do the key here. So E is the trait for free, and then lowercase e is the trait for attached. Okay, and then let's add on, so you could be this, or this, and then here down at the bottom, it's just this one. Alright, next one. So wrinkled seeds are recessive to smooth seeds. So wrinkled is recessive, smooth is dominant. And seeds, S is one of those letters that looks the same in capital and lowercase, so I'm not going to use S. And then W also looks the same in capital and lowercase, so I'm just going to go with the letter A, just to make my life easier. So we'll go with the letter A. So this wrinkled would, A would be recessive, so this would be AA, and then smooth would be a capital, smooth would be capital A, but it could be capital A or capital lowercase a. Show a plant that always produces wrinkled seeds. Well, you only get wrinkled seeds with that. Okay, and cross with a heterozygous smooth seed producing plant. The word heterozygous there, very important. So heterozygous is 1 capital and 1 lowercase. Once you get the parents, the rest of this is easy. So fill this in, capital from the side, lowercase from the top, capital from the side, lowercase from the top, and then lowercase, lowercase, and then lowercase, lowercase. Alright, easy. So now let's do our key. So just kind of what we did up here. So A goes with smooth, and that could be AA or AA. Those will both give you smooth. And then the lowercase a goes with wrinkled. And this has to be lowercase a, lowercase a. Alright, so for phenotype and genotype, start with the dominant, capital. So we got 0% of those. No capitals for the genotype. And then the next one would be the heterozygous, capital lowercase, and we got 2 of those out of 4, so that would be 50%, capital lowercase. And then the other one is lowercase, and again we got 2 out of 4, so that would be 50% of the lowercase trait. All right, that's genotype. So then for phenotype, we had round or smooth and wrinkled. So for wrinkled, which would be lowercase a, we got 50% wrinkled. 2 of them are wrinkled, and the other 2 are smooth. All right, so I'll do one more, and then I'll leave you just this last one to try yourself, see if you get it right or not. So, as in the previous problem, show a heterozygous smooth plant crossed with another heterozygous smooth plant. So heterozygous, heterozygous. So I'm going to do my drawing tool here. So heterozygous is capital lowercase, and it says that both parents are heterozygous, capital lowercase. Fill that in. Alright, so then once that's filled in, then we, let's do our key. It should be the same as before. So I wonder if I could just copy this. Alright, and then for our phenotypes, you start with the homozygous dominant. So there's 1 out of 4, that's 25%, is capital A, capital A. And then there are 2 out of the 4 that are capital A, lowercase a, so that's 50%. And then there's just 1 out of the 4 that is lowercase a, that is the homozygous recessive, so that is 25%. Lowercase a, lowercase a. And then for phenotype, what does the plants look like? So 3 out of the 4 inherited at least one, capital letter A, so we're going to have 75% are going to be smooth, that's the dominant trait, and then 1 out of the 4, which is 25%, is going to be wrinkled. Alright, your turn. Fill in this last Punnett square, answer the question, and then you can submit this assignment.